Hi, my name is Violet, and today I'll be doing a presentation for you on education. My full name is Violet Wang, and I'm in 7th grade. Currently, I'm going to a private Christian school, but I will soon be enrolling in homeschooling. So this is my presentation on education. A really good question to start with is, what is education? What is defined as education? What are we going to talk about in this presentation? Well, I think education, for one, is any form of a standard school day. So, for example, my school starts at 8:15 and ends at 2:50, right? That's about 7 hours-ish, and that's how long my school day is. Any form of a standard learning. So from preschool, kindergarten, elementary, middle school, high school, college, university, those are any form of standard learning because a lot of people take it, right? Maybe not university and college because some people drop out of high school, but from around preschool to high school is what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. Any form of standard schooling, so either private, public, or home-based. So you can either be a private or a Christian schooler, a public schooler, or home-based. So all of these things is what education is and what we're going to talk about. It is not limited to this, however, there's a lot more than you could include in education, but this is what I want to talk about today. Another good important question is, why education? Why should we be spending 15 minutes of our lives talking about education? Well, why education is important is because we spend a lot of time in school. Here are some numbers. We spend about 5% of an 80-year lifespan in school. That's not a lot, right? But if you think about it, don't you remember some of the things that you were taught in kindergarten or preschool? Right, that ties into the second point. Education forms the foundation of our lives. You might not remember specific events from preschool or kindergarten or elementary or even middle school, but all those things shape who you are today. The things that I've done before and the things I've learned before help shape my choices today. Things that I do, things that I say, and things that I wear, right? All of those things establish a worldview for me. If I'm being taught the right thing in my entire life, I'll be good set to go when I go into society. A few more numbers for you is we spend about 7 hours in school, varying depending if you're home-based, public, or private, right? But 7 hours of school every day, not including time you have to spend on homework, friends, projects, events, all that stuff, right? And not including that time, 7 hours. Do that 5 times a week. That's 35 hours. And how much time do you go to church? Maybe 2 hours on for youth group, and at most 2 hours for a sermon, right? That's like 4 hours. And even if you have stuff out of church, there's no way you can have more than 10 hours. And you still go to school for 35 hours. That's a lot. All the time spent in school will shape who you are. The things that you experience, the things that you say, the things that you do, all the things will affect your life. So that's all well and good. But because we spend so much time and energy and we use so much of it, there has to be a problem. This is why we're talking about it. And the problem is that God is removed. 3 words summarizing the entire thing. God is removed from the entire system. We no longer teach things about God. We no longer do that. Public schools, you are not allowed to talk about God. You can't use class time to talk about God. That's how much God is removed. He's gone from the system. We don't have him anymore. We are no longer, if you go to a public school, you're no longer being taught that. In private schools, you're no longer being surrounded by that. In homeschool, you will feel God. But you might not be Christian homeschooled. You might just be homeschooled, right? But if you're Christian homeschooled, you'll know that God is around you, but there's still problems with homeschooling, right? To get a little more in-depth about it, we have 2 pictures here, right? One symbolizes the foundation of evolution. The other symbolizes God's creation. So on top of evolution, we can build off of a lot of things. For example, we can build off things about evolution is we can have abortion, we can have same-sex marriage, we can have LGBTQ communities, we can have divorced families, we can have all that stuff because that's how we were established. Our foundation, that's our foundation. If we were being taught this entire lives, we know that there's no creator and we can basically do whatever we want. And another pillar is establishing God's creation. But God's creation, it's also different because you can have a lot of things built on top of God's creation. For example, you can build on top of God's creation morals. You can build on top only two genders, male and female, only male and female marriage, no abortion, good marriage, good family, no divorce. You can build all of that stuff on God's creations. But what if we remove that foundation? Then it's slowly going to fall. If we remove the foundation of God's creation, everything built on top of it, we can't have that. And at the end, if we remove it completely, the foundation, then it's going to fall. So to get a little more in depth about each, the problem, I break it down into 2 points. Our foundation is shaky and we no longer teach the truth. Our foundation is very important, as we saw in the picture. If we lose our foundation, we're going to fall. Think about it. If you were going to build a building, right, a really tall building, a really good building, a building you wanted to be like a monument or something, you could plan everything out. You could buy all the materials. You could get all the money. You have all the time. You have all the quotas. You have all the business contracts. You have all of that stuff. But then you mess up the foundation and the entire building falls within a few days. That's how important our foundation is. If you send your kids to a public school and only expect the church to do things for you, for example, for like 4 hours every week, you send them to church and expect them to have the worldview to last them in public school. You can't expect that. They're not even being taught that God created the world in public school. You're being taught the exact opposite. And because we spend so much more time in school than we spend in church, they're going to be led astray really, really easily. Another thing is we no longer teach the truth. If I was being taught a lie my entire life, for example, stealing is good. If I was being taught that my entire life, right, then I grew up thinking, okay, I can steal whatever I want. That's fine, right? That's the environment. That's what they're teaching me. That's how they're teaching me. I'm okay to steal. But it turns out it was wrong. And then instead, what I'm going to think is, oh, you guys are dumb. It's right. Because I've been taught that my entire life. That's what kids think now. Oh, you think God created the world? How prehistoric. How primitive. How dare you, reject science? That's what they're being taught. Because they don't understand that they're actually being taught the lie. They're being taught the wrong. We're being taught the truth. And when we try to share that truth, they're going to think that we're wrong because they're being taught the opposite thing their entire lives. And that's how important it is to establish a foundation and teach the truth. We can't expect, if we send our kids to private school or public school, for them to turn out okay if we throw them at church. Even Christian schoolers, even if you're being surrounded, even you're being taught Bible all the time, right? All your friends, everybody else might not have the same views. And to build off of that and to get a little more specific is in each different schooling system. First of all, public school kids are taught the wrong things. So that's 2 things because they're being taught the wrong things and exposed to the wrong things. So it's 2 bads about it, right? Christian public school kids are taught that abortion is okay, evolution is okay, same-sex marriage is okay, right? We already established all of that. And because they're being taught these kind of things, they're going to grow up thinking these kind of things. And if we try to convert them, it's not going to work. Even if you're a Christian and send your kids to public school, they're going to be led astray. For example, I have a lot of friends who go to public school in my church, right? And I hear stories about their schools and about things that happen in their schools. But I also see public school kids who go to church regularly bring their boyfriends at a young age to church. And I also see them say bad words. They're Christian, but they still go to a public school. Another thing is Christian school kids are exposed to the wrong things. Christian school kids, right? They're being taught all the right things. Our school, for example, we will actually talk about LGBTQ, same-sex marriage. We'll actually talk about those kind of things. But the kids are exposed to all the wrong things. I have a lot of friends that I hold very dear, that I pray for them all the time, that don't have the right worldview. They think that same-sex marriage, whatever, that's fine. That's what society tells us that's okay. Okay, so what? Right? Or they'll think, oh, abortion's fine. Like, are you trying to rob people of their free will? Or they'll think, oh, Trump is bad. You know why? Because he doesn't allow same-sex marriage. Or things like that, right? I don't understand why they have those views. They go to Christian school. They've hopefully been going to church their entire lives, but yet they don't have those worldviews. Homeschool kids, not exposed to enough of it. I know many of you might disagree with me, but this is what I've seen so far from homeschooling that I hope to change. Is a lot of the homeschool kids, right, are kind of naive, especially when you go like younger. They don't actually know the horrors of this world. They're not being taught it. So I feel like if they go into society without any knowledge of this stuff, they're going to be swept away really, really easily because they're not even being taught the truth. And that's really important because we need to teach them what's happening. If they're not, you can protect your kids for so, so long. You can keep your kids homeschooled from kindergarten to high school to college if you can, right? You can protect them from as long as you go into society. But the moment they do step foot in society, they're going to be swept away by the traumas of this world. You don't have to give them a phone until they're, 21. You don't have to give them any form of social media. But at the end, they're going to have to step out in society one way or another. And if they don't have the correct worldview for that, they're going to be swept away easily. And now it seems that each form of education is a lose. Every form you're sending them is a lose. Public school, you're doomed. Christian school, 50-50 chance. Homeschooled, like a 25% to 50% chance that they're going to be swept away. That's a very big percent, and we don't want that, right? So what's the solution? How do we fix this? Looking at this, homeschooling is probably the best option because it's an easy fix. But a lot of people aren't able to homeschool. Homeschooling requires time, money, a kid's ability to be able to self-learn or learn with other people or to have self-learning, to be self-reliant. Some people just don't have that. So what's the solution? Well, one thing is our parents should be teaching our kids and being role models and teaching us the principles of faith, the very foundations at a young age. So parents, this is mostly faced to you. You should teach and spend more time with your kids at a really young age. So at the time of preschool, kindergarten, elementary, and maybe even middle school. Talk to them for 30 minutes, 15 minutes, driving to and from school or from activities. Ask them, hey, what happened at school today? Oh, let's look at this from a Christian worldview. And that ties into the second part as well. Talk about present day topics from a Christian worldview. For example, the Pride Land that's being established in Israel. That's a horrible thing to violate God's holy land. But talk about it with your kids. Be like, hey, did you hear about this? What do you think about it? Okay, so what do you think that's going to do? What do you think about this? Let's look at it from a Christian worldview. Let's look at it from the Bible. We should be teaching our kids that, grounding them in the very principles of our faith. If you can't send your kids to homeschooling, you don't have the time, energy, then talk to them more. Spend more time with them. You have to sacrifice some to help your kids. So at the end, it does come down to family. But at least for education, we should be doing our part and teaching our kids about present day worldviews, teaching them about a Christian worldview. I hope you learned something from my presentation, and thank you so much for just taking 15 minutes of your time to listen to it. And remember, spend more time with your kids. In the long run, it's going to benefit you a lot. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Joshua Chen, and today I'll be sharing with you about government. So let's get started. Okay, first, what is government? And so government is an institution that was designed and established by God to restrain evil, promote good, and maintain order. And so it's important to remember that government was established by God, not by human beings, which means that government is a good institution. It's not something that was made by corrupt human beings, but by God. And the purposes of government were listed in Romans 13 verse 4, 1 Peter 2 verse 14, and 1 Timothy 2 verse 1 to 2. They said to restrain evil, promote good, and maintain order, respectively. And humans and consequently government are flawed. So the Bible calls us to obey the governing authorities unless they contradict God's commands. So our first priority is God, but aside from that, we must obey government. But if government contradicts God, then we are to obey God. And it's important to remember that all earthly governments are temporary. And so everything that on earth that we see now, it's it's all gonna pass away. But the kingdom of God, the ultimate government, the New Jerusalem, this will be the only permanent government. And so sometimes that's a comfort to us because when we see evil governments, we know that they will pass away eventually. And where does government authority come from? And this is a really important question because we sometimes ask, why do we obey government? Because government has to have a source of authority so that we it has credibility so that people are willing to obey it. And government authority comes directly from God, and no person holds power unless it is granted by him. And so when we see wicked politicians around us in the present day, it's important to remember that God let that person be in power. And so we can take heart and know that this is all under the will of God. And God controls the rise and falls of leaders. And to quote the Bible, he removes kings and establishes them. And so God has supreme power over all of government. No politician, no dictator, no governmental institution is in power unless he permits it. And all earthly governments are leaders are answerable to Christ. And so they have a responsibility to do what is according to the Bible. And sadly, not a lot of people do that, but ultimately, they're all answerable to Christ. He is the supreme source of authority. And this is backed by the Bible because in the New Testament, Jesus says, "All authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me." And so that's where government authority comes from. And now we come to the primary function of government, and that's also a very important question. What is government supposed to do? Now that we know that God has given government authority, what is it supposed to do? And I said in the first slide that the primary function of government is to restrain evil, promote justice, and maintain order. And that is the primary function of government. That is why government exists. And government should maintain order and carry out punishment on evildoers. And yes, Romans 13 verse 4 calls government an avenger and a sword bearer, which carries out God's wrath. So government's purpose is to promote justice and restrain evil. So that's why there are laws, because the purpose of laws is to let citizens live a a fair life, a good life, and make it so that it's difficult for criminals to exist. And government should promote justice and righteousness. Judicial systems should not show partiality and provide a peaceful environment for citizens, which is what I said. Citizens should have the right to live in a peaceful country. And that's why expansionistic and imperialistic governments are wrong. And government is just to provide a good environment for its citizens. Not just, but one of the primary functions is to provide a peaceful environment for its citizens. And so, yeah, here is a picture of of basically what I covered in the previous slides. And so the government, the source of authority, all authority is granted by God. And here are the three primary functions of government. And it actually coincidentally has the exact same verses as I put. Um, restrain evil, which is Romans chapter 13, verse 4, and promote good and maintain order. And yeah, at the bottom it says government is an institution of God, so it's not of man. Okay, the sphere of sovereignty, the limits of government. So where does government authority stop? And in the Bible, God clearly sets the limits of government, and he assigns other important duties to the family and the church. And so it's important that government doesn't overreach those responsibilities set by God. And we see happening today that a lot of the time governments are trying to have more control over our lives. But a lot of the areas that it is trying to affect are actually the domain of other institutions that God created. And so God assigns government the clear duty of restraining evil and promoting justice, as I said. And God entrusts the family to nurture his children in the truth and educate them in his word. And he calls the church to provide spiritual support and to minister to the needs of his people. And all of these three are clearly defined. Government and a large portion of education is the government is involved in because of public schools. And because government is involved in it, we see how it has gotten corrupted and people have turned away from God. And so that's why God has given a lot of the responsibility of education to the family. And that's why more and more people are homeschooling today, including me. And God calls the church to provide spiritual support. And sometimes government can also interfere in that, especially in Canada. There are there's actually a bill going through Parliament to limit some of the rights or some of the abilities of the church. And so yeah, that leads directly into our next slide, the problem with government. And we can see around us that human government is very flawed. It's intensely flawed. And some examples are politicians insist on their own wants. The leaders are bribed. They manipulate people who are in their power. And we see all around us, there are a lot of there's a lot of evil, and a lot of it is directly involved with the government. And like one example where I live, which is in Toronto, uh, police officers, which are a branch of government, they're one of the main enforcers of justice, and they're one of the main ways to restrain evil. They were caught working with criminals, basically. And so we can see how government or a branch of government is very twisted because they're the exact opposite of what they were meant to be. And a large part of this is because there are no earthly mandates or boundaries that restrict government. And so except for God, there's no really any power to stop government from doing what it wants. And that's very dangerous because they can do a lot of things that otherwise private institutions couldn't do. And the root problem, the root cause is because of our fallen state, because we ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden, and there was the fall, and human government will never be perfect. And we're continuously rebelling against God. So there will never be a perfect government. And actually, some people think that there will eventually human beings are good and that they can achieve perfect perfect rule, like a perfect society. But that's not true. And this is just a fun fact that shows some of the shortfallings of government. And so if you visit the National Archives website and you do a search for the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, you will find a harmful language alert above it. And it shows how the founding documents, the founding principles of the US government are now have a harmful language alert on them. It shows the change and the decline of government of, in this case, the US government from its beginnings. And now moving on to sort of the action part, the temporary solution to government. And that's our role. And so the Bible calls us to be salt and light in the world. And many theologians actually argue that being a Christian automatically makes you an agent of change. And yes, in the New Testament, we have Jesus calling us to be salt and light. And in Genesis 1, verse 26 to 28, specifically more 28, God calls us to be fruitful and multiply on the earth and subdue it. And that is subduing it means in many cases changing it. And so I think there are kind of two different types of change we can do. One is actually being part of the government, like Joseph and Daniel. We can make government our vocation, and so we can draft and implement laws according to God's supreme law. And to do that, we shouldn't just force our religion. We should do that by being the most capable and trustworthy people in the room. So that's number one. We can go into government and make it our career and help and use God's principles to make laws. And number two is to speak out as Nathan and John the Baptist did and point out where government has shortcomings and push for change in society. And yeah, we should be unashamed to speak the truth. And so there's a lot of the time Christians or other people, they see the problems in society and they feel uncomfortable, but no one speaks out. And that's a big problem. Like there's a quote, I forgot who it was by, but it was during Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And so when the Nazis started persecuting one class, they didn't speak out. And when they persecuted another class, for example, the Jews, then they persecuted uh, another class. No one spoke out. But finally they persecuted the class the class which that person belonged to, and no one spoke out for them because they didn't speak out for the other people. And yeah, here's a picture a, of the two different types of how we can be a change agent for government. And so I put there's the builders and the speakers, and in between who are the people who are both builders and speakers. And the builders are the people who actually go into government, and the speakers are the people who criticize government. And Daniel and Esther did both. And on one hand, we have Joseph and Nehemiah and Wilberforce, Abraham Kuyper. Uh, and on the other side, we have Nathan, John the Baptist, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Ambrose of Milan. And so these are just some examples of Christians who stood up to make a change for God. And moving on to the ultimate solution. And the ultimate solution is to take power out of the hands of sinful human beings and put it into the hands of the righteous God who never sins. So the ultimate solution is just to let God take over government. It was created by God in the beginning, so a natural end would be that God is our government. The reign of Jesus Christ in the New Jerusalem will replace human rule and be a perfect example of his righteousness. And God says this in the Bible. that there will be the New Jerusalem. And so the Bible promises that God will be the government. He will be the king. And so we have a happy promise to look forward to. And he says he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. And that is our ultimate solution that we can look forward to. And that's the end. Thank you for listening to me.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Priscilla, and I've taken the class with Pastor Lenny, Being a Change Agent. Today, I'm going to discuss what problems media brings into our lives and how we can be change agents. So the problems that media brings into our life fall into 3 categories. The first is false knowledge, the second is false community, and the last is false goodness. Let's begin with false knowledge. True knowledge is what I like to think the best story that illustrates this is Elijah waiting in the cave to hear the voice of God. He hears a still, small voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to listen for that still, small voice, don't we? So Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust, later became a great psychologist. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that through media, we are given a urgent, demanding kind of knowledge that chokes out this space for growth and freedom. So let's take a look at what this does. It grabs our attention, it's urgent, and it demands reaction. Woman folly is loud and seductive and knows nothing. But she demands reaction, doesn't she? And also you have the idea that often media gives you the sense of being alone. Stolen water is sweet, bread eaten in secret is pleasant. I think you'll find that very frequently in the world of media. Now, media tends to be camera culture because we don't really have the technology to send our favorite perfume scents to each other and communicate that way. We can only use pictures and a little bit of audio. That leads to of an environment where it's very easy to dupe people. And that's what's been done here. How many of you are aware of the war in Gaza the past year? Have you noticed ads in your YouTube channels, perhaps, or on Facebook that show starving children, and they tell you that children are starving in Gaza? There's a double illusion happening here. Because on the one hand, the children starving in Gaza are not suffering from anything that you and I can help them with, no matter how much money we send to those campaigns. But secondly, the children they're showing are not even Gazan, and they are not even starving. Here's one common picture from those campaigns. This child is not starving. He is suffering from cerebral palsy, and he's actually most likely a displaced Yazidi child. This child I know for sure was a Yazidi child, and he was suffering from cystic fibrosis, not starvation. But these 2 pictures were used, along with many others, to spread a story that there was mass starvation in Gaza that we could cure by donating to Hamas. Of course, Hamas uses that money to buy weapons, not to feed the people. And you'll often find your feed is overwhelmed with information. Have you ever had 20 or more messages on your phone when you picked it up? Have you ever thought, I don't have time for this? Yes, it's true. We only have 24 hours in the day. Think about it. If we're going to respond and not react to every single one of these messages, how much time would that take? It's going to take a lot more time than we're ready to commit. So we either have to have fewer messages or more response time. Okay. First of all, we have Psalm 193. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Just with God, ask him, is there any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting? We should only be concerned about offense towards God. Okay, number 2, let our moderation be known to all men. Paul is advising that when we deal with people outside of the faith, we become so good at moderation, that is, not overdoing anything, that we're famous for it. The Lord is at hand. That's the beginning of wisdom, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, you may ask God. So remember, slow down and think. If you're going to respond to anything, take the time that it takes to respond. Now we're going to talk about false community. Let's first take a look at an example from the Bible of a strong community that God truly was pleased with. In Jeremiah chapter 35, God sends the prophet to a family that was living in Jerusalem called the Rechabites because they had a great-grandfather named Rechab. He was told to give them wine and invite them to drink. And all together they said to him, "We will drink no wine. For Jonadab the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, You shall drink no wine, neither you nor your sons, forever." Now, God was so pleased with this that he said to Jeremiah, "Because of this, Rechab will never lack a man to stand before me." That means no matter how much time goes by, these people are going to be around and serve God. That's a huge blessing. Now that is godly community, and godly community is made to make us stronger. But what does mediated community do to us? Let's start with the myth of the global village. When radio was first becoming a thing, and when and people were beginning to think, perhaps radio and television can really start uniting people. People started to talk about the global village, world peace, no more war. Everyone will understand everybody else. That's all it takes. We're just going to become this happy utopia. That hasn't really happened. In fact, the whole idea of capitalizing on the suffering of people either cast people as weak so that you can make money off of them, or actually cast some people as evil and gives you the right to cancel them, right? So actually, instead of promoting an environment where people can express themselves and find truth, we've actually ended up creating a police state instead of a utopia, right? And victim dependency is a huge thing here because you can use someone else's suffering to make money. You can sympathize with someone else's suffering, and that makes you look good. And you're teaching people that your suffering makes you profitable. And so you learn to be helpless and to stay that way. So think about it. Sometimes we accept things just because we're surrounded by them so much. That's why it's better to be a patient person than a warrior. Better to have self-control than to take a city. Okay, let's talk about false goodness. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was an author who got sent to the Gulag. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize in literature for the books that he wrote about his time in the Gulag. And he presents this idea because it's exactly the opposite of what cultural Marxists will teach. And that's that art is great because it's art, not because it's used for political ends. In fact, even though it can be used for political ends, it doesn't stop being art. And that's a direct opposite from what cultural Marxists will teach. They'll teach you that something is beautiful and artistic because it makes a political statement. Does beauty exist? Let's look at milk. Milk is something that comes from one animal, and it takes their nutrients and gives it to a smaller, weaker animal, right? And milk is a beautiful thing in many ways. What does Coca-Cola do? Coca-Cola takes advantage of your brain chemistry, the release of the feel-good from eating sugar, and it harnesses that to make you give them money. So is Coca-Cola a beautiful thing compared to milk? Very different message, isn't it? All right. So all art tells a story about its makers, and it tells a story about its audience. These are two Greek statues. This is the Discobolus, and it was from the early ages of Greek art when people felt we should make something beautiful. And the most beautiful thing we could make is a human body, because humans are beautiful. So they made women, they made men, and they made them in these very beautiful poses. I mean, they knew nobody actually looks that way, but they said, this is something beautiful. It's worth making a sculpture out of. 250 years later, this is art. Is it still beautiful? Well, it's technically excellent. You see all the hairs, you see all the veins in the body, and you see the skin on the dimples, and it's every feather on the goose. It's very, very hard work, and it's very well made. But is it art? Because this is a picture of a child strangling a goose. So not all technical skill means beauty. Art can transcend political ends, but that doesn't make it what it is. Okay. Finally, so because we have these twisted ideas about beauty, let's take a look at some twisted ideas of beauty from the world of media. First of all, virtue signals instead of real virtue. The media world has a way of being, this is you in that world, but it doesn't affect you in this world. So you're going to say, they struck me, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I didn't feel it. When will I awake? I must have another drink, another go at the media. And it leads us to do things like that child strangling the goose. We can celebrate wickedness instead of beautiful things. And we can take beautiful things and take away their beauty. For example, Jane Austen, she writes books that are very beautiful. Mansfield Park is a great image of some Bible passages, right? The master comes at a time when no one else is anticipating it, right? So you take these beautiful stories that Jane Austen's written, and the media will say, you like Jane Austen, you must like people who wear costumes and speak in English accents. So you should watch period drama. Okay. Or you like Lord of the Rings. You like to see pretty elves and people who can shoot bows and arrows and swords and that kind of adventure. You're going to love Game of Thrones. Right? Because it's also fantasy genre. So they've taken beautiful things, taken all the beauty out of those things. You just have the shell, the presentation of the thing. And they say, this is what you want. This is beautiful because you like that other one. So they've drained us of a lot of beauty. So what do we need to do in a world like this? If there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, we need to think about those things. So let's take a look at the new camp of things that are coming out now. These are all different companies that are now producing Bible-based media or media with biblical values. So you can check those out. You can add more to the list. It's definitely a good thing it's a growing list. A lot of audience members are looking for this kind of stuff now. Or you can try to reform the media system. If you do, these are the books that I recommend you try reading first. Finally, keep doing these things. You can do all of these things through your local church. You can stay connected to Jesus Christ. Why do we see Jesus Christ as the ultimate medium? God loved the world. He didn't just say he loved the world. He didn't just take pictures showing how much he loved the world. He sent his son to the world to die for it. This is the ultimate idea of what a medium should do. We should also witness God's strength in true suffering. Where can you do this? At your local church. There are people who have cancer. There are people who have all kinds of suffering, and they cling to God's strength. God's strength is bigger than their suffering. And once you've seen true suffering, victimization online just doesn't seem real anymore. Next, we should build community. Show up and be there in person. We can use tools like I'm going to text a message someone because we have to meet at a certain time and we have to figure out the time. But we shouldn't depend on these tools to build the relationship. The actual relationship building should happen in a more thoughtful way. Double check the truth before passing these along. Again, the local church is a great place to do this. Connect with people who are good at telling the truth. Talk to your pastor. And finally, collect, celebrate, and make beautiful things because media is usually ugly. Ugliness will dull your senses. Share in suffering. There's a lot of suffering in the world. Share as a good soldier of Christ Jesus because no soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits. Have some discernment, witness true suffering, and share in true suffering as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Finally, reprove, rebuke, exhort. Be sober-minded, endure suffering. Do the work of an evangelist and fulfill your ministry. I hope that's what you guys will do. And I hope that's what you will do when you encounter media. Do these things. do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. Thank you.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Vincent Gao. I am an 11th grader here in California, and I have the privilege of presenting to you guys the topic of art today. Let me get the presentation started, and we'll get right into it, as I know I'm on a bit of a limited time, so we'll be moving quickly. Okay, so a couple months ago, I had the honor of bringing some of my art students that I teach in my art class to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, California. This is a beautiful museum with a lot of different types of art displayed within it from a wide range of time periods, and I was able to show my students really the history and the context of what they were learning about. And this museum I hadn't also been to in a few years. It's been a while since I went, so I didn't really know what to expect regarding the exhibits and the new kind of what's on show and those different kinds of things. So I was kind of going in a little fresh as well. And really what I was met with shocked me, to say the least. As I walked into the museum, I was met with this poster that looked something like this, and it was just straight in my face, and I was like, whoa, what's happening here? And as I kept on moving on, there were new exhibits, as you know, and one of the exhibits were this. And I was just really surprised that these elements have started to get into a once beautiful museum that were so various in the types of art styles and paintings that had been displayed. But these things have started to, make their way into the museum. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still many beautiful things in this museum. I saw beautiful paintings such as this one of animals entering Noah's Ark, or these wonderful landscape paintings with different colors and emotions painted by various different artists throughout the history of art. And I even saw one of God's paintings, which was this beautiful rainbow when the sun kind of refracted through the windows of the museum. So it was this really big contrast, and I was really intrigued by this, so I decided to dive a little bit deeper into really how art has changed throughout history. And that is exactly what we're going to be going over today, the topic of the arts. Now, as I said, we're on a bit of a time crunch, so we're going to move fast. Let's go over what we're going to be talking about today, and we'll get straight into it. So, for the contents of today's presentation, we're going to first start you guys off with the definition of art, right? Defining what we really want to be learning about. Next, we're going to move on to the evolution of art. It's going to be a bit of a history lesson. We're going to go over different time periods, the art of the time and artists of the time, things like that. And finally, we're going to apply art to our own life and see how it affects the way we live and the way we look at God and the way we look at the world. So, let's get straight into it. Now, we have to begin first, of course, by defining art. Art is a really wide range of things, as you guys can tell. There are many different art forms, as you guys probably know of. But today, we're just going to be narrowing it down to a single kind of category, which is the category of visual arts. Some of the examples you might know in visual arts might include painting, sketching, drawing, whatever it is. But since we have a limited time, I'm not going to go super into the other categories. We're just going to be talking about visual arts. And I have two definitions of art here for you. The first one is from the Noah Webster's dictionary. I highly recommend you guys check that dictionary for words that you guys don't know, because it gives a really good definition. And same thing for art here. It is the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. So I highlighted a few important words that we need to know when knowing what art is, and it's that it takes skill and it takes creative imagination. Those two are key components of art. Now, secondly, I made a definition by myself, as I'm a believer in Christ, so I would like to see everything from a biblical worldview and align it with God's nature. And so I kind of blended in the definition that I learned from art teachers, art classes, to my own worldview, which is that of a godly worldview. And so my definition of art would be a concept or an idea made it into some sort of medium which adds to our enjoyment and understanding of God and life. So the first part is really similar, but I kind of made the second part myself because I believe that God created art and intended it to be beautiful and good. And we have a couple verses here that supports this idea. Actually, Psalm 139:15 says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." God created us too. He was the ultimate artist and he did so skillfully, right? So Isaiah 64:8 also says something along the lines of God being an artist or a craftsman, right? "But now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay and you are potter, and all we are the work of your hand." God is described as a potter here, sculpting and really shaping us from clay, literally. And I think that's just wonderful how God is kind of using these human-like terms to describe him creating all of these things, including us, and making them so intricate and so beautiful. And so this is my belief that God intended art to be something used to glorify him and glorify all of creation. So that's a little bit about what art is. Now we're going to go into the main chunk of this whole presentation, and that's a bit of a history lesson on how art has evolved. As we know, time progresses and people have ideas have consequences lead to different actions, and that's how history progresses, and art follows along as well. So we're going to take a look at how that works. We're going to begin with a period called Antiquity. This was the 1800s BC to the 1500s AD. If you guys don't know what that stands for, BC stands for before Christ, and AD stands for Anno Domini, which is also kind of a different time period that comes after, BC. So during this period, art was one of a kind. It was kind of revolutionized compared to what was before it. And what was before it, well, art was mainly used for practical reasons, such as recording things, communicating with each other, and religious practices such as, sculpting or idols and things like that. And so that was what happened before this period. Now, during this period, we saw what were the beginnings of humanism. This places great interest on humanity, man, the mind, and the body. The great empires of this time, such as the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, they began this worldview by placing man as the highest form of creation. They really started to look at themselves and say, hey, we're not too bad. We're pretty good. And so they started to put the focus on themselves. Now, before the Greeks, like I said, monumental sculptures were made for gods, not men. They were made for worship, pagan, polytheistic worship, whatever it is. But the Greeks and the Romans created more kind of idealized views of the perfection of man, really looking into whether it's the anatomy, whether it's the brain, whether it's how we think, how we feel, and really perfecting that, thinking, oh, we're such great creations. And even to the point where we were likened to God. And so you can really see how this self kind of adoration becomes sinful in the end when we are compared and equated to God. Now, both of these sides, the Greeks and the Romans, they strived for detail and attempted to capture figures and forms with a lot of naturalistic detail. So if you look at this sculpture here of young Hercules, which is actually a demigod in one of the pantheons of these Greeks and Romans, he looks realistic, right? The hair looks flowing, the muscles, the anatomy looks really, really realistic. That sounds ironic, I know, but that's what the Greeks and the Romans strive for. And we're going to see this style come back later on, but not before a period that was really different from this one. So this is where we move on to the Middle Ages, or as some of you guys know, the medieval period. During this time, we saw another huge shift in what was valued in life. Religion made its way back to the main stage of the world, but this time, it wasn't the pagans, it was the Catholic Church. From the 1500s AD to the 1400s AD, the Catholic Church began to become the main patron of all kinds of artistic disciplines. And because of that, art was stripped of all its humanism, because these religious guys, they were like, okay, we have to make art a certain way for it to be holy, for it to be not idolatrous, for it to be, good for worship, all these different things. And so there was this purposeful separation from the mundane dweller, which were the regular people, the sinners, the peasants, and the holy figures, which were like Jesus Christ, Mother Mary, all these different figures, right? And so as you can see from this piece at the bottom, the figures weren't very naturalistic. realistic, and a lot of them were bathed in gold, and they had halos around them. And so you can see there's not a lot of expression, there's not a lot of movement going on, and there's just a whole lot of gold on this entire creation. Pieces were also dedicated to serve as altar pieces, pulpits, books of hours, so all of these religious purposes, right? They weren't really used to consecrate man as this perfect being anymore, and instead it was used for something different. Now, we move on to the next period, and this is where we see sort of a balance between the two. This was the Renaissance period. I know many of you guys know a lot of paintings during this time, whether it's this painting shown here, the creation of Adam, or a lot of other great paintings such as, the ones in the Sistine Chapel, these great works by people like Michelangelo, Donatello, these wonderful painters. Anyways, this period was a happy medium. The subject matter would come from the Middle Ages, as we said, religious subject matters, but there is also a rebirth to the humanism from the Greco-Romans. So it made these religious subjects seem real. Do you know what I mean? So you see these faces here, right? They're not the same as from Middle Ages, but they're also depicting Adam and God, right? Biblical figures. So we see a mixing of the two art styles. Now, new improvements in perspective, lighting, colors, and realism took art to a whole nother level. It was around this time that oil painting was kind of being revolutionized, and so there were these great explorations of color, of shadows, of light, of contrast, saturation, all these different things. And art was just going to a whole nother level. And so during this time, art slowly moves away from those legalistic rules of religious paintings and starts to make its way back to looking at the beauty of Imago Dei, or the image of God, right? So we start to look more on the beauty of things that God has created while also focusing on God himself. The next period we come across is quite a long time, and there were abundance of styles during this time, but we're going to just name it as the Baroque to Impressionism period. There were a whole lot of different styles when the church moves off of the main stage of authority in society, and it gives some more freedom of thought to these thinkers and these philosophers and different people. And so it strays off religion a little bit, and it focuses more on mankind again and the consciousness of the mind. So during this time, we see some big events happen, such as the Enlightenment. If you guys are familiar with that, it caused the spark of a plethora of art styles because, as we know, ideas are reflected in artistic creations. So there's different styles, whether it's the more rational and logical styles like neoclassical or Voltairian, or more emotional and expressive like Rococo styles and Romanticism styles. There's a lot of different little distinctions between these styles, but we're not going to go into that so much because I know you guys don't want to take a whole art history class, right? So we're going to move on. Avant-garde artists also began to take brave steps in exploring these styles and expressing their own thoughts rather than portraying that of another, such as the Bible, right? So artists during this time, some of the known ones are like the one that painted this painting on the right, Claude Monet, or people like Vincent Van Gogh, one of my personal favorites, as we share the same name, or different people, they start to put their own heart, their own emotions into these paintings. And it was a step forward, really, because the paintings, again, strayed a little bit off of those harsh restrictions of religion and moved a little bit more onto life, onto pondering the things of purposes of life and all these different philosophical things. And so we see more of a human kind of approach to art. And finally, we move on to modernism and postmodernism. This period lasted from the 1900s to now. So it's still going on right now. And when I took this topic during art history, I just really let out a big sigh because when you really look at how far we've come, it's not that pretty, really. So let's talk about this. The 19th and 20th century saw the new horrors of man's sinful nature. Well, we had World War I, we had World War II, we had the Cold War, we had all of these different decimations of mankind and destruction and these political conflicts, and that caused art to be viewed in a totally different way. Instead of being used to portray religious figures or to portray emotions of the heart of oneself, art began to be used as humor, as mockery, and means to point out problems in the things of this world. Art also became more political as people like political leaders, or whether it's war tyrants or whatever it is, used propaganda through art to legitimize their own power. And many artists during this time basically entirely rejected the representation of skill, of expression, and all confines have essentially been broken. So there's no more of that, oh, you got to paint it like this, or oh, you got to draw it like this, you got to study art for this amount of time to be disciplined in this profession. No, all of those rules, all of those chains have been broken. Not chains, really. They're not chains. They're not binding you. They're restrictions, right? They're not a bad thing. So we've seen a whole outline of what art has become, this whole entire history lesson. But now we're going to go on to the last and the most important point. And I didn't really make slides for this because I want you guys to listen close. I want you guys to think about this yourself. And that is, what are you, I'm pointing at you, what are you going to do about art? As I mentioned before, art is a reflection of ideas, of concepts, and when those concepts come from inherently sinful minds and hearts like ours, the product will also reflect so as well. But there's a big but here. Our minds and hearts are no longer like that. Why? Because we are new creations. I'm going to read a verse to you guys. 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, "Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are new." So the Bible clearly says that when you have faith, when you gain salvation through Christ, you are literally made into something new. And therefore, your heart and your mind are also transformed and renewed. Now, where does art come from? Well, it comes from our hearts and minds. And so therefore, as new creations, our artistic creations should reflect so as well. Romans 12:2 says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but ye be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God." Again, our work should reflect the will of God. We are to reflect God's good, acceptable, and perfect will through our art, and not our own flesh and sinful desires. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean painting religious pieces like the Middle Ages and making it so precise and concise and biblically accurate. But it does mean to capture beauty and harmony through our various forms of art and ultimately align it with God's nature. Recently, I was watching this interview with this Christian brand, and it was a designer. He was a shoe designer. And he was talking about making these Christian-themed things and aligning it with God's nature. And he said something really interesting, which I think goes perfectly with what I was talking about here. He says, a good Christian shoemaker doesn't make shoes adorned with hundreds of crosses and golden jewelry and things. No, he makes a good shoe. Okay? Like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be crazy religious or crazy biblically accurate and things like that. It has to be good in the eyes of God, right? And we can clearly tell what is good, what is beautiful, what is harmonious with God in the Bible. And so it is really up to us to align our creations with the nature of God and his creations. God made us and everything to be good, and so our creations are to do so as well. Whether God has given you the talent of music or visual art, as we talked about, or poetry or cinema or whatever it is, he wants you to be a good steward of it because he gave you those talents. And like the parable of the talents, he gave different people different amounts. He gave different people different times, different amounts of talents. But what are you going to do with it? Are you going to use it to your fullest ability to glorify him and use it as a shining light in the darkness? Or are you going to bury it and throw it away or use it for the wrong things? God has blessed us all with some kind of gift, but ultimately it is up to you whether to glorify him, whether to not glorify him, whether to do the opposite. But in the end, the choice is yours. I hope this presentation today in some way opened your eyes up a little bit more to some of the talents that you have or some of the ways that you can glorify God. Or maybe next time going to an art museum, maybe appreciating art a little bit more, because it really has been a huge part of the lives of many throughout the course of history. And I believe that it can be a big part of your life too. And it can change the world.